This is the book of Daniel, lecture 10, and we will be looking at chapter 10 and chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 all belong to the same vision in the book of Daniel. So the last part of the book contains some substantial information, which begins with the third year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. This revelation was given to Daniel, and it mentions Daniel's Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. This final vision offers the most historical detail of any of the visions. And in fact, especially as we get into chapter 11, you will see that there is copious detail about the history that happened to the Jews between the time of Cyrus the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes. One good thing about this area is that there is general unanimity for the vision by various interpreters until you get near the end of chapter 11. The early part of chapter 11, most interpreters understand in the same way, and chapter 10 as well. So with that in view, we will begin on slide 122 with this vision of Daniel of the kings of the north and the south. In chapter 10, Daniel there's a preface to this vision in which Daniel has been praying and mourning for 3 weeks. And finally, at the end of that period of time, as he's standing on the bank of the Tigris River, he sees a man dressed in linen with a belt of gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice sounded like the sound of a great multitude. Slide 123. This man dressed in linen has a lot of similarities to the vision that John received in the Revelation in chapter 1 of Jesus Christ. And there are some interpreters that therefore would say that the man in linen in Daniel chapter 10 is the same as the vision of Christ in Revelation chapter 1. I understand the logic of that interpretation, but I am somewhat doubtful about that. First of all, the idea that this man in linen was helped by Michael the archangel doesn't sound appropriate for a way of describing Jesus Christ. And I think it's probably more common and more in line with the passage to understand this messenger in chapter 10 of Daniel as the angel of the Lord, the Malach Yahweh, who appears in various passages in the Old Testament, not the least of which is in Zechariah chapter 3, a passage that is from about this same period of time, where the angel of the Lord appears in a courtroom scene with Yahweh and Satan. The year of this vision is the same year that the Jews in Jerusalem completed the great altar, but it's also the year that they suspended the work because of opposition. And in fact, the work would be suspended for 16 years, according to the book of Ezra. And at this time, then, this vision comes to Daniel about things that would be relevant to his people in the future. Slide 124. In chapter 10 and verse 14, it quite specifically says that this vision has come, and the explanation of the vision has come to Daniel, so that he would know what would happen to his people in the future. And by his people, this of course means the Jewish people. The vision concerns a time that is yet to come. In this future, there would be 2 powerful political entities, Persia and Greece. These are going to be mentioned then in verse 20 of chapter 10, when it mentions the prince of Greece and the prince of Persia. These seem to be the 2 same political entities that we saw in chapter 8, Greece and Persia. During this period of time, concerted attacks upon the Jews would be made, both from the Persians and from the Greeks. And behind this secular history, or this visible history, there would be an invisible component in which spiritual warfare in the heavens would be conducted. Powerful forces of evil which would be against the people of God, the Jews, and at the same time, powerful forces of God, including Michael the archangel, which would stand to defend the people of God. We see the same sort of thing in Zechariah chapter 3, where Satan stands to accuse Joshua the high priest, and Joshua as the priest represents the Jewish people, the people of God. Here in the book of Daniel, you have a similar kind of thing, different sorts of language, but the same kind of thing, in which there is tremendous opposition against the people of God in both Persia and Greece. Slide 125. Behind the visible history that is spelled out upon the geography of the land and the various kings and potentates who rise and fall, the scenes in Daniel say that behind this there are elements of heavenly warfare. And in fact, this heavenly warfare is quite typical of apocalyptic literature. You find it in the well-known book of Revelation, but you also find it in the various books of the Jewish pseudepigrapha. And these descriptions about heavenly warfare have raised a lot of discussions about the nature of spiritual warfare. And one of, I guess, the important ideas that have come out of this is the idea that there are spirit beings who serve as representatives or guardians of the various nations of the world. Michael is described that way. He is described as the one who supports and protects the Jewish people. So Michael the archangel is the representative, if you will, of the Jewish people. But then you find elements in chapter 10 of the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. These might very well be regarded as guardian spirits as well, or at least representative spirits. But in this case, these seem to be evil or fallen spirits, and they seem to be the spiritual forces that are behind the attacks upon the Jews during the Persian period and during the Hellenistic periods. Slide 126. We certainly know from other passages in the Bible that there is an array of spiritual beings, all of whom are accountable to God. We meet them in one of the earliest passages in the Bible, in the book of Job, in which the sons of God come before God and are accountable to him. And among them, Satan himself comes, because even though he is an evil entity, he is still accountable to God. You find it also in the vision of Micaiah in 1 Kings 22, when Micaiah saw the council of heaven and various spirit beings who are, in a manner of speaking, sitting at table with God and proclaiming this or proclaiming that, or suggesting to do this or suggesting to do that. And you also find them in some of the Psalms. Psalm 82 and Psalm 89, you have similar kinds of passages. In the larger text of the Old Testament, there are quite a number of words in the Hebrew text that describe spiritual beings of various sorts. Sometimes it's just the word gods, not in the sense of Almighty God, but in the sense of spirit beings. And sometimes it's the word like malachim, which is angels or messengers, the kodeshim, which are the holy ones, the sons of God, the Beni Elim, which are mentioned in the book of Job. And there are various other passages like the servants of the Lord, the ministers of the Lord, cherubim and seraphim, not to mention Satan himself, who is the accuser, but is a spiritual being who is accountable to God. Now, all of these various descriptions seem to depict some kind of spiritual council over which God has jurisdiction. And in fact, back in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 32, there's a very critical passage in this regard, particularly as it is expressed in the Septuagint and the Qumran scrolls. In these texts it says, when the Most High divided the nations, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. Now, if you're reading a text that's based on the Masoretic text, it will say the sons of Israel rather than angels of God. And in fact, the New International Version will translate this as sons of Israel. On the other hand, if you read something like the New Revised Standard Version, it depends more upon the Qumran scrolls than the Septuagint, and it will read sons of God at this point. In other words, spiritual beings. In any case, there is a very old idea that goes back at least before the time of Jesus, going back to the Qumran scrolls and to the Septuagint, that suggests that over the nations of the world, each of the nations has some kind of spiritual representative. And if that number is taken to be 70, because of the 70 nations of the world, then you would go back to Genesis chapter 10 to discover the 70 nations that make up the nations of the ancient world. In our present case, then, we would have Michael, the archangel, who is the representative of Israel, and then you would have two spirit beings who represent Persia and Greece, both of whom are antagonistic toward the Jews and the people of God. Slide 127. Based then upon this idea of the heavenly council as angels, as guardians, the antagonism of the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, or the angel of Persia and the angel of Greece, should be linked then to the historical attempts to exterminate the Jewish people, or the people of Israel. You find one major example of that in the Persian period, and one major example of that in the Grecian period. In the Persian period, it will be described in more detail in the book of Esther, in which a Persian antagonism toward the Jews was headed up by a man named Haman, who sought to exterminate the Jewish people and exterminate the Jewish religion. Excuse me. In the period of Greece, this antagonism is described most fully in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, in the Apocrypha. And it describes how Antiochus Epiphanes, whom we ran into back in chapter 8 and earlier in chapter 7, how he made such pronounced efforts to exterminate the Jewish religion and to Hellenize the Jews. The burden of this last vision of Daniel, this fourth vision, primarily is going to concern the persecution of the Jews during the Hellenistic period. And much of what we're going to see in chapter 11 of Daniel will parallel what we already have seen in chapter 8 of Daniel. Slide 128. As we transition then into Daniel chapter 11, the text says, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and those 3 kings probably are Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Darius the Great, who ruled consecutively as the first major kings in the Persian Empire after the conquest of Babylon. Then it says, a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases, and after he has appeared, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds. Prior to him, then, there would also be a king who would stir everyone up against the kingdom of Greece. Now, the 2 kings that are described here, the one that's described at the end of verse 2 and the one that is described at the beginning of verse 3, probably refer to Xerxes the First and Alexander the Great. Xerxes is more familiarly known in some of the English versions as Ahasuerus, who was the husband of Esther. And in fact, he did just exactly that. He made a concerted effort with a huge army to attack the Grecian mainland. And there are various historical battles that are associated with Xerxes and his army. In the period following that, then, Alexander the Great would arise, and he would seek to bring reprisals upon the Persians for their empire and their attempt to take over the Greeks. But, as it says, his empire would be broken up and would be parceled out toward the 4 winds. Now, the breaking up of Alexander's empire probably refers to the death of Alexander, and the parceling out of his empire toward the 4 winds probably refers to the same thing that we ran into in Daniel chapter 8, when it says the large horn of the goat was broken off, and 4 prominent horns emerged in its place. Of those 4 horns, the ones that were most significant, for the Jews at least, would be the dynasty of the Ptolemies from Egypt, and this would be what Daniel will call the king of the south, and the dynasty of the Seleucids in the north, what Daniel will call the king of the north. So in verse 5 it says, the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger, and he will rule his own kingdom with great power. This probably refers to Ptolemy the First, who ruled from 305 to 282 BC. He's the king of the south who's stronger. Seleucus, after losing Babylon to Antigonus, we know this from secular history, found refuge in Egypt where Ptolemy made him a general. And in fact, he helped Ptolemy defend Egypt in 312 BC against an invasion by Antigonus, and followed up that advantage by recovering Babylon and extending the Seleucid rule over all Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. And this is probably what is talked about in verse 5, that the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders would become even stronger. The king of the south would be Ptolemy the First. The commander that's even stronger would be Seleucus the First. Now, as we enter into this period of history, which is going to take us all the way until the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, we are entering a period of history that is probably not quite so well known to most people, unless they are quite familiar with ancient history. Perhaps the best place to read this history, at least from a secular viewpoint, would be in Volume 7 of the Cambridge Ancient History, The Hellenistic Monarchies and the Rise of Rome, which is published by Cambridge University in 1975. In fact, much of the essays that you will find in this volume, Volume 7 of Cambridge Ancient History, you can read through this volume and you can read through Daniel chapter 11, kind of one on each hand, and see the parallels very clearly. I will try to point them out as we work through this passage of Scripture and through the history that's involved. Slide 129 is a bas-relief of Xerxes, who is the king who attacked the people of Greece in verse 2. And then in slide 130, you see a depiction at the top of a sarcophagus which shows Alexander fighting against the Persians, probably Darius III. And then you find two images. One, a minted coin of Ptolemy I. This would be the king of the south. And then a bust of Seleucus I, which is an image of the king of the north. In slide 131, once again, we look at the areas of these two kings and their succeeding dynasties. Seleucus I in the north has the Seleucid Empire, and his descendants will rule over this large area of Mesopotamia and Syria. The king of the south is Ptolemy I, and his descendants will rule over Egypt. And between them, as we talked about in chapter 8, there is, of course, the Holy Land, the area of Palestine and Jerusalem. If you look carefully on the map on 131, which we did actually look at back in chapter 8 as well, you will notice that there is a very small depiction of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee. It's very small, but it's in that small coastal area that is colored green in the map. Both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids wanted to control Palestine, and this is going to come out quite clearly in the remainder of chapter 11. So going back to chapter 11, we want to pick up in verse 7 and 8. Well, actually, let's go back and pick up a little bit earlier then. Pick up in verse 6. In verse 6, it says, after some years, they, that is the king of the north and the strong commander, or the king of the south and the strong commander who is the king of the north, they will become allies. And the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. Now, this description is that even though initially these are hostile to each other, they come to terms of peace, and that peace is confirmed by the marriage of the daughter of one to the other. In 252 BC, Berenice, the daughter of Antiochus II, is going to be married to the son of Ptolemy II, who is the ruler of Egypt. However, notice in the book of Daniel it says, she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be handed over, together with her royal escort and her father, and the one who supported her. This seems to refer to the intrigue that happens in this family. Antiochus already had a wife, Laodice, and even though she had been banished by a conspiracy, when Antiochus married Berenice, Berenice and her infant son by Antiochus were assassinated, and Antiochus was poisoned by a conspiracy that was engineered by Laodice. And Laodice now emerges as the queen regent over Syria with her son Seleucus II. And that brings us up then to verses 7 and 8, where there is a Ptolemy III who ascends to the throne of Egypt, and he is determined to avenge the assassination of his sister in the north. So he musters a large army, and he attacks Syria in a very extended campaign which occurs in the late 240s BC. He manages to capture Damascus, even Antioch, before returning successfully to Egypt with great booty. This is the reason in verses 7 and 8 it says, "One from her family line will arise to take her place, and he will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them, and he will be victorious. He will seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone." So these early verses parallel very, very closely what we know of the history that is happening in this part of the world in the 240s BC. Now, when we get to verse 9, we pick up another thread. After Seleucus II failed in a counterattack, the two warring factions agreed to a 10-year truce. And in fact, you find that mentioned in verse 9. The king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. And they came to a truce. Then Seleucus III and Antiochus III, the sons of Seleucus II, who ruled successfully, continued to build the Syrian army after their father's death. And this is described in verse 10. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Finally, in 219 and 218 BC, Antiochus III marches south to attack Egypt. In his attack, however, he was defeated by a smaller army of Ptolemy IV, and in fact he was compelled to cede Palestine back to Egypt, even though he had temporarily gained control of it. And so this is described in verses 11 and 12. When the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, it will be defeated. And when the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. Eventually, of course, Ptolemy IV died. And in the meantime, Antiochus III has been rebuilding the Syrian army. And now he marches southward once again in 202 and 201 BC. And this is described in verse 13. For the king of the north will muster another army, larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army, fully equipped. Now, during this time, of course, there are the Jews in Palestine and Jerusalem who are caught between these two powers. Some of them probably favored the Ptolemies in Egypt, and some of them definitely favored the Seleucids in the north. In fact, the pro-Seleucid Jews of Palestine mobilized to break away from Egyptian rule. But they, in fact, were defeated by an Egyptian general Scopas, and this is described in verse 14. In those days, many will arise against the king of the south. The many here would be many of the Jews or of Daniel's people. The violent men among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. General Scopas defeats them, and they are then relegated to living under Egyptian rule. But back in the north, Antiochus III is not to be thwarted. In the end, he actually defeats the Egyptian general Scopas. He captures Sidon on the Palestinian coast, and he finally brings Palestine firmly and permanently under Syrian control. So in verse 15 it says, "Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city." This would be Sidon. "The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand." When Antiochus III enters Jerusalem, which was in 198 BC, he was welcomed by the pro-Seleucid Jews as a liberator, as though he had liberated them from Egypt. However, as history is going to bear out, his sovereignty over the Holy Land is going to open the door to terrible oppression, because now, as it says in verse 16, he would have the power to destroy it. And so verse 16 says the invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. To secure his gains, Antiochus III married his daughter, Cleopatra I, to Ptolemy V. Now, this was really an action of intrigue, because he was hoping that his daughter would work behind the scenes to add all Egypt to his territory. So there would not be both a northern and a southern branch of the Hellenistic Empire, but that the northern branch would swallow up the Egyptian branch. However, it didn't work out the way he thought, because even though he was hoping that his daughter Cleopatra would do this, she was loyal to her husband, and so the whole thing failed. And this is described in verse 17. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom, and will make an alliance with the king of the south, and he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom. But his plans will not succeed or help him. So, he now redirects his attention to the coastlands of western Anatolia. And here Antiochus III begins to be quite successful, but in the end, he's going to meet a Roman army and is turned back by Scipio at Magnesia in 190 BC. And in fact, Scipio forces him to sign severe peace terms in 188. And so this is described in verse 18. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands. This would be the Anatolian coastlands, the area of modern Turkey. And he will take many of them, but a commander, and that commander would be Scipio, would put an end to his insolence and turn his insolence back upon him. Well, the severe peace terms, as is common in the ancient world, meant a lot of payment, a lot of tribute, and he was unable to meet the indemnity that was forced on him by Scipio. So, because he didn't have the funds to meet what was required, Antiochus III resorted to pillaging temples, various temples in the ancient world, to raise funds, and he ranged as far as Susa in the heartland of Persia. But the locals near Susa were so angry that they stormed the forces of Antiochus III, and they killed him in 187 BC. And so this is described in verse 19. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall, to be seen no more. The successor to Antiochus III was Seleucus IV, his son. And he would send out someone to raise funds, a tax collector, called Heliodorus. Now, the name Heliodorus is not mentioned, of course, in Daniel chapter 11, but you will find him described in some detail in 2 Maccabees chapter 3. Later, Heliodorus would engineer the assassination of Seleucus IV, so that, as it says in the book of Daniel, Seleucus IV would die not in anger or in battle, and that occurred in 175 BC. So these events are described then in verse 20. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. So the death of Seleucus IV paves the way for the most invasive oppressor that the Jews had known to this point, and this oppressor would be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This is the Antiochus Epiphanes that we met earlier in chapter 8 and also in chapter 7. And now for the remainder of Daniel 11, there is going to be a lot of detailed attention given to the severe attack of Antiochus Epiphanes upon the Jews in Jerusalem. We will leave off lecture 10 at this point, and we will pick up with lecture 11 and the subject of Antiochus Epiphanes and his war against the Jews in our next session.